Okay, in this second narration on the authority of Aisha, that the Prophet ﷺ commanded or suggested that the male be freed before the female. Now, if this narration is sahih and authentic, then what we can understand from it is that the Prophet ﷺ is suggesting that those people who will bring about a greater benefit, or those people who have rehabilitated and don't pose a threat to society anymore, that they should be freed. So let's remember and refresh that at that time there was no formal way of detainment. If a person was captured as a prisoner of war, there were no jails and there was no military confinement or any kind of imprisonment at that time. It was that the person will be taken as a slave, as a prisoner of war. Now, if that person shows signs of maturity and rehabilitation, and that if they can be put back into society and freed, and they won't pose a threat, perhaps they've even become Muslim, etc., then the Prophet ﷺ heavily encouraged these people to be freed. But it could be that the master doesn't feel that that person, and I use the term master loosely again, doesn't feel that that person has rehabilitated, or it could be that the person, the master, has a need for the slave still. So the Prophet ﷺ left it for that person to make that decision. Again, we have to remember a lot of this is cultural and a lot of this is based on need, and the Prophet ﷺ was not the person who invented slavery. Slavery had already existed, but Islam came with mechanisms to make sure that that slavery becomes loosened. And we also know throughout history, later on, Umar radiallahu anh made a jail system. This is at a time when nothing like that existed in the world. He made a prison system, and people would then either be exiled or imprisoned based on that. Therefore, what we understand is that slavery was not the only understanding that we had for detainment. Now, we also know that from this narration that it's nothing to do with gender. So this is something I think that they might use to try and attack Islam, to say, look, the Prophet ﷺ encouraged the freeing of men but not females. But we also know the incident of Barira. This is agreed upon in Bukhari and Muslim, that she was a female slave. She was able to buy and purchase her own freedom through the agreement with her quote-unquote masters. And the Prophet ﷺ encouraged it. She was a believer, she was responsible, she was somebody who was mature, she was somebody who, like we said, didn't pose a threat or anything, and the husband remained behind in captivity. Therefore, through other narrations and other incidents, we know that it's got nothing to do with gender. Now, seeing as we are here talking about gender, there is obviously a very common misconception and a huge allegation thrown against Islam all the time, where people are constantly looking at ayat and looking at hadith, where they are saying that Islam condones, recommends, or even obligates the use of female slaves for the purpose of fulfilling male desires. And that is categorically incorrect. That is categorically incorrect. Now let's go back to the definition of what slavery is in Islam. The Western definition is where a person is, like we said, stolen and then made into property. And with that definition, then nothing stops the master from doing whatever he wants because they see them as property. And even historically, we know through our own history here, masters used to do whatever they wanted, and they were somewhat above the law when it came towards their slaves. And they could basically treat them however they want, and all of that would go unchallenged. Whereas in Islam, like we established before, when a person takes hold of a captive and allows for that prisoner of war to enter into their home, what they are in effect doing are saying that we will look after this person. And there are so many ahkam and rulings and fiqh behind it all. So if the master is not looking after quote-unquote slave, not feeding them, not clothing them, then it could be then that master is, held and rebuked for that. We will admit, though, however, that the master, again, quote unquote, master, has a level of authority over the slave. So it could be that they can make a decision without going to court, etc. And that is something, which has been mentioned in the books of fiqh and even found in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. But we'll touch upon that in a second. There is a very important principle that we have to understand when it comes to understanding the Sharia. And I'm going to tie that in with a couple of other issues. But let's admit right now that slavery, in the Western understanding and the Islamic understanding, two complete different things. They see them as a commodity. They see them as even being subhuman. I mean, there's even incidents of people being human beings put in zoos, and people looking at them and prodding them, etc. And that's how they viewed people of color. And slavery was, a way of justifying that also. Whereas in Islam, there are rulings, and a person will be sinful, and a person could even then be reprimanded by the local authorities if they are not looking after their slaves correctly. Therefore, there is a huge understanding difference between what Islam sees as ownership, quote unquote, and the rulings connected to that. Now, when we can understand that, we can then understand that forcing your slave, making life difficult for your quote-unquote slave, all of that is not permissible. All of that is not permissible at all. So if a person was to create a burden that they cannot bear, give them a workload that they cannot bear, and in the situation that we're talking about right now, force them to have sexual intercourse, that is categorically impermissible. There's actually an incident that happened once that in the time of Umar, he sent out Khalid bin Walid on an expedition, and there was a young man who actually had intercourse and forced intercourse with a slave that he was obviously very much attracted to. He then, after that, showed remorse and wanted to repent, etc. And part of his repentance was that Umar radiallahu anh commanded that this person then have the punishment of fornication be applied to him. Why? Because he had done something which was incorrect. She was not his right hand possessed. She was not something that he had been given to look after. And again, this goes back to our definition as to what slavery is, and when the master becomes responsible, you have to take that responsibility correctly and sincerely. And the second thing is that you can't force a person in having sexual intercourse inside of marriage or outside of marriage. It's not permissible at all. And we've talked about that before when it came to the issue of marital rape. There is another issue here now, and this here now, there are again different scenarios. So now the ulama have mentioned, if a man takes possession of a female slave and she is married and the husband is within captivity also, then it is not permissible for that man to have intercourse with that woman. So say, for example, that man, the master, has in his captivity a woman and her husband, then that nikah contract remains in force between the woman and the husband, who are both in captivity. So then she is not permissible for him to have intercourse with. And this is the opinion of the majority. If the man is captured and the woman remains uncaptured or in their home country, in their home territory, etc., then again the nikah contract is valid. So he can't go over there and capture her and then do whatever he wants with her, etc. There is an issue between the ulama, which is that if the woman is captured and the husband remains uncaptured, does the nikah contract become invalidated? And the opinion of the majority here is that the nikah contract, the marriage contract between her and her husband, is invalidated. And then with that, she could have been married before, but now, because she's in captivity, that marriage has been nullified. And what they've said, the majority of ulama, like we said, have said that the contract of prisoner of war and that relationship between her and her master takes precedence now because of the situation that she is in. That is found in the books of fiqh. However, again, we need to understand that for what it actually is. Is it permissible for him then to force her? Say that she's in his captivity, but she doesn't want to. She doesn't like him. She's still got a lot of enmity towards him. Can he then force himself on her? No, it's not allowed. But let's look at it from a different perspective. Let's say she's in captivity and her husband is very far away, but now she's actually warming towards her master, and she actually has feelings towards him, and those feelings towards her husband have been lost, etc., and it's been a long time, etc. Is it then permissible for the husband to have, the master to have relations with the slave? Then the answer becomes yes, because she's from the right-hand possessors, as has been mentioned in the Quran, and the marriage contract has been absolved. So what we are establishing here is that there are scenarios where it becomes categorically incorrect and impermissible for a man to have relations with his slave, even though it is within, or she is within, or both of them are within his ownership. And in certain scenarios it becomes permissible, but there are conditions to that also. Like we said before, she is no longer married to her initial husband, and now she becomes a slave because her situation has now changed. However, he still cannot force himself on top of her. And this is again now an opinion of the majority of the ulama, is that the man cannot force himself upon the woman. And again, this is something that we can also deduce from the narration that happened between Umar and Khalid and that man who was then punished for doing so. That is a point that we need to clarify when it comes to the ahkam of slavery and slave women. It's often translated in the text that these people want to use to attack Islam as her being a concubine. Now that is not correct either, because the fact that a concubine gives the impression that the woman is used for the sake of his own sexual desires, and then she is discarded whenever he doesn't want her. However, what we understand from the Sharia, and we touched upon this last time as well, the concept of al-walad. And this is something that, is not hidden even amongst those people who try and criticize Islam, is that when a person has intercourse with a slave, she, if she becomes impregnated, will become al-walad. Now what that means is that automatically when the master passes away, she is free, and the child is born free. And there are rulings which are similar to him being within a marriage, which apply to al-walad. Therefore, it cannot be understood that when a man has intercourse with the slave, he can do whatever he wants, and he can throw away after he's had his desires fulfilled. That doesn't make sense, because we know through Islam, with every kind of sexual interaction, there comes rulings and responsibilities, and included with that is a dowry. Included with that is him not, again, throwing her away when he doesn't need her anymore. So now we've established that there's a difference between ownership and, the ownership in the West and ownership within the Islamic understanding. We've also established that the nikah contract remains intact. We've also established, or could remain intact, we've also established that the man cannot just freely do what he wants without having that slave or captive being given to him. And we've also established that he can't force himself. And we've also established that if he does have relations, then that comes with responsibilities. There's another ruling which adds to the understanding of us showing that, force is not allowed at all, and using them for that purpose only is not allowed at all, which is that the ulama have said that if he wants to have relations, then he has to go through a process of al-istibra before he does that. And what that means is that he cannot just do it whenever he pleases. He must make sure, at least in the first interaction with her, to make sure that she goes through a cycle of menstruation. So let's understand it. So now, if a person attains a prisoner of war and he likes the look of her, she's attracted to her, whatever, he can't just force himself upon her. That's not allowed. And he cannot, even if she wanted to, and even if she gave consent, they can't do it, because they have to go through a process of al-istibra, which is for her to go through one menstrual cycle and to make sure that the womb is clear, etc. So that tells us that the man, he's not able to just do it whenever he wants and then have free access at any given time. There are rulings, there are strict rulings. Another ruling which has been mentioned in the books of fiqh, which is that if the man has been given partial ownership or partial custody, again ownership, quote unquote, or partial custody, etc., then he's not allowed to have relations at all. So say, for example, the ruler says to this man, you have half and your neighbor has half ownership, and both of you half, equally have to look after this slave, male or female, but in this scenario, let's say female. So equally, you have to pay towards her accommodation, you have to pay towards her clothing, etc., whatever. Then that man doesn't have full ownership, and because of that, there is no such right that he has towards her in that manner. So when we're looking at all these different ahkam, we will then really understand that Islam is showing us that there is no free reign, so to speak. There is no force. There are a lot of rulings which are connected to the fact that a man can have relations with his captive and his right hand possess. Now, before we close, and it's been long, this one, and I apologize for the length, there is a very important principle in the Sharia, which is that even if something is permissible, so it's permissible for a man to have relations with his right hand possess, even if something is permissible, if there is a greater harm, or if the ruler says, right, I know it's permissible, but I'm not allowing you to do this because of the current climate or the situation that we live or the generation that we live in, then that rule from the government must be respected. And there are many examples of this in the Sharia, and there are many statements from the ulama on this. And this is actually a matter of aqeedah for the believer, which is that if the ruler says you are not allowed to do this thing which is actually permissible for you, then you must respect that ruling, and it then becomes haram for you to do so. So now let's say we live in a modern age. If the ruler was to say, nobody's going to have right hand possess, and if you do have a right hand possessor captive, then you are not allowed to have relations unless if she gives consent, etc., etc. Then those rulings must be respected. Those rulings must be respected. So now I think what we've established is that a man cannot force himself, and that comes from various different viewpoints. The fact that she could be in a nikah contract, it could be that she doesn't give consent, it could be that he's not being allowed by the government to do so, it could be that she's not freed her womb and she's not been through istibra, it could be that he doesn't have full ownership. There are many different scenarios which would prevent that. So what we do understand from this is that consent is an important issue from both parties. So then for us to understand that a man can do whatever he wants with his right hand possess is completely incorrect and absurd. And ultimately, now this applies to Muslims and non-Muslims alike, and I think this is a very important principle, which is that Muslims, as well as non-Muslims, are all going to be questioned in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the way they understand the religion and the texts. So if a person was to say that this is the understanding that I have of Islam, and I have it of a way which fulfills my own personal desire perhaps, or allows me to paint a negative picture of Islam, perhaps, then all of that is impermissible. We have all been commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to understand the religion for what it is. So it will come about that you will find some Muslims saying certain things about Islam, but that's incorrect. And you will find certain non-Muslims saying certain things about Islam, but that would be equally incorrect. So if you find non-Muslims saying, well, concubines are justified in Islam, and then you might find an extreme rhetoric of people saying, yes, they are, and we're not apologetic for that, then that doesn't justify it, and that doesn't give it the correct interpretation from Islam. We have to understand Islam for what it actually is. So we have to go back to the text, we have to go back to definitions, we have to go back to what the scholars have said. Therefore, when a person looks at these rulings, then they will see that there are a lot of grey areas that are being discussed about, with people not really learning the ahkam and the rulings, without looking at the narrations, without looking at the facts. And that is injustice, whether we're talking about religion or whether we're not. So, walillahi alhamd, we have now established from various viewpoints here that forcing your female captive to have intercourse is not allowed at all, categorically, in Islam, and that consent and the lack of a nikah contract and the process of al-istibra' and the process of a person making sure that he has the go-ahead from the government. And there are many viewpoints and there are many different angles that a person can establish the fact that forcing and raping is never allowed in Islam. Wallahu a'lam.